1834, Kentucky. A pair of twins were born under a blood-red moon. From the moment they opened their eyes, strange things began to happen, things that no science could ever explain. What bound them together was not love nor blood, but something darker. This is the macabre mystery of the Hargrave twins. The storm raged above the old wooden farmhouse, and the wind carried with it a sound that made the walls tremble, as if the heavens themselves resisted the birth that was about to take place. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret Hargrave labored in pain, her breath heavy, her voice calling out into the thunder, while her husband paced with desperation. In his eyes the air was thick, and every creak of the floorboards seemed alive, as though the house was watching and waiting for something to arrive that did not belong to this world. The cries of Margaret grew louder, and the midwife pressed a cloth to her brow, whispering that she must hold on for only a moment longer. Then, with a sudden silence broken only by thunder, the first cry was heard, but it was not a cry of one child. It was the sound of two voices rising together in strange harmony, one high, one low, yet perfectly aligned, so that it struck the ear as if a single soul had been torn into two. The midwife froze, her hands trembling. She lifted her eyes to the corner of the room and swore she saw shadows stretching across the walls, moving without the flicker of a candle, as if unseen hands reached for the newborns. She whispered a prayer under her breath, but the words faltered. When she looked upon the faces of the twins, two boys lay before her, their skin pale, their eyes opening at the same time, as if commanded by one thought, and in those eyes she saw no softness of a newborn, no innocent blur of sight. Instead, there was focused, sharp, and knowing eyes that followed her movement like the gaze of someone who had lived before. Margaret reached out weakly, pulling her children close with tears of relief. But the midwife could not move closer. She felt the air grow heavy around her chest, as if the presence of these boys pressed upon her lungs. She whispered to herself that children are blessings, yet something in her heart cried that these were not blessings. These were omens. The thunder shook the farmhouse again, rattling the glass in the single small window outside. Lightning carved the sky into jagged veins, and for one moment its light filled the room, and the midwife swore she saw two shadows upon the wall, larger than the infants, tall figures that leaned over Margaret and the twins, though no one else stood there. She dropped her cloth and stepped back, muttering that she could not remain in the house. The father demanded to know what frightened her, but she shook her head and refused to speak, her lips pale, her face drained of color. She whispered only that the night had birthed something unnatural, something that would bind the family to sorrow. The twins cried again, their voices rising together, perfectly timed so that the sound vibrated. In the walls of the farmhouse, the father pressed his hands to his ears, while Margaret rocked them in her arms. Yet even she felt uneasy, for their cries did not sound like ordinary infants. There was a rhythm to it, almost like words, unspoken. Hours passed and the storm refused to calm. Rain hammered the roof, and the floor became damp with the leak of water. But within the farmhouse, the only sound that mattered was the echo of the two voices. It was as if the night itself had bent to welcome these children. When dawn finally came, the storm eased, but the land around the farmhouse seemed wounded branches torn from trees, soil washed away by the rain. The animals in the barn, restless, refusing food, bleating and stamping as though they had sensed what had been born within the house. The midwife left before the sun fully rose, refusing to eat or drink. She crossed herself over and over as she walked the muddy road back to town, and when the townsfolk asked her later why her face looked hollow, she said only that she had seen shadows that did not belong to this world. The Hargrave twins were wrapped in blankets, their mother exhausted, but strangely quiet. She looked at their faces side by side and felt both love and fear. She did not understand why, But a chill ran through her when she realized that even in sleep, their tiny chests rose and fell in the exact same rhythm, never breaking, never out of sync, as if one breath guided both. From that first day, everyone who came near them felt the same weight, a strange heaviness pressing into their hearts. The neighbors who visited to offer congratulations stayed only minutes before finding excuses to leave. They would later whisper that the children stared at them with eyes far too knowing, far too calm for newborns. And so from the very first breath of their lives, the Hargrave twins carried with them a silence that unsettled every soul who encountered them. A silence louder than the storm that had brought them into the world, a silence that would grow darker with each passing year. As the seasons passed and the boys grew older, the strangeness that surrounded them could no longer be dismissed as the oddities of childhood. Every gesture, every sound, every expression seemed to mirror and distort itself in ways that unsettled all who lived with them or even came close. When Joseph laughed with sudden joy, Jeremiah would not join him. Instead, tears would stream down his cheeks as if laughter in one body became sorrow in the other. Margaret, their mother, tried to soothe them, rocking them both in her arms. But her heart trembled, for she could never understand how one smile could summon another's grief. She whispered prayers in the night, yet the pattern never ceased. There were days when illness crept into the farmhouse. Jeremiah once caught a fever, his skin hot to the touch, his body trembling with weakness. But as Margaret prepared a damp cloth for his brow, she turned and gasped for Joseph's. Face was flushed in the same heat, his skin burned. Though he had not been ill a moment before, their suffering was inseparable, as though one body was no more than an echo of the other. The neighbors began to notice their silence too. Margaret often found them sitting together at the edge of the fields, or by the dim fire in the kitchen, their bodies still, their eyes fixed upon each other, unblinking for hours. They spoke no words yet. Their breathing matched perfectly a rhythm that seemed guided by something unseen. She would call to them, sometimes loudly, but they never broke their stare until both turned their heads together, as though moved by one command. At times, Margaret swore she heard whispers, soft, low tones that brushed against her ears like breath. Yet when she entered the room, their lips were sealed tightly shut. The sound would fade into the walls, leaving her alone with the rising hair on her neck. She questioned her sanity, yet even their father admitted to hearing murmurs. In the night one afternoon, when the sun fell low behind the hills, Margaret saw Joseph sitting quietly in the yard, his eyes on the ground, a shadow across his face. A moment later, Jeremiah stumbled in from the barn, his knees scraped raw with fresh blood. Margaret gasped and turned back to Joseph, only to see his knees untouched, but his hands trembling as though he had fallen himself. It was as if pain was a rope stretched between them, tugging one body when the other was wounded. The animals on the farm grew restless when the boys were near. The family dog that once slept by their crib now growled low in its throat every time they entered the room. Chickens scattered wildly at their footsteps. The horses in the barn kicked at the stalls and refused to calm unless the twins were driven away. The Hargraves tried to dismiss it, yet in their hearts they knew the animals saw what they could not. Their father grew distant from them, avoiding his sons whenever he could at the table he ate. In silence, refusing to meet their eyes, he told Margaret late at night that no natural children could share suffering so deeply that they must carry within them some mark from a place not meant for mankind. Margaret defended them at first, yet she, too, had begun to dread the sight of their endless staring. At school they fared no better. Their teacher noticed how Joseph would answer questions without looking at his book, while Jeremiah's lips twitched as though forming the words in silence. Once during a recitation, Joseph stood quiet as Jeremiah remained at his desk. Yet the passage poured out flawlessly from Joseph's mouth. The room fell into horrified silence. The teacher, trembling, demanded to know how this was possible. The boys gave no answer, From that day, the townsfolk began to keep their distance. Whispers followed them down every road. Children crossed themselves as they passed, and elders muttered that no good could come from souls bound so tightly together. The pastor himself declared that some bonds were not gifts from heaven but chains from somewhere far darker. Margaret watched her sons grow beneath the weight of fear. She loved them as a mother loves her own flesh, but each time she saw their eyes lock in, that unbroken gaze, she felt her breath falter. It was as if they spoke in a tongue older than words, as if they shared a secret that no other soul was meant to hear. And so as the years went by, the strangeness of the twins became impossible to deny. Their bond was a thread woven too tightly, too deeply for the world to ignore, a bond that seemed to defy the laws of nature, and that filled every heart that saw them with a dread that only deepened with time. In the nearby town, whispers moved faster than the wind that carried dust through the streets, and before long, every home, every shop, every corner echoed with the name of the Hargrave twins. Women who once greeted Margaret with kindness now crossed the street. When they saw her approaching, they pulled their children close as though the boys carried some unseen sickness. Mothers whispered prayers under their breath, clutching rosaries until their knuckles turned white. And when Margaret asked why, they looked away with shame, but none dared to answer. Children were the cruelest of all. They gathered in small circles behind the churchyard, pointing at the twins. Whenever they passed through town, they whispered that Joseph and Jeremiah could read thoughts, that if you looked into their eyes for too long, they would steal secrets from your heart. One boy claimed he dreamed of them standing at the foot of his bed, their eyes glowing pale as the moon. The story spread until every child feared the night. The pastor himself, the voice of faith and authority in the town, began to speak openly of them from the pulpit. He declared that some souls were born twisted, that baptism could not wash away the stains of darkness. He did not name them directly, but every ear in the church knew who he meant, and the congregation nodded with tight lips, their eyes avoiding the Hargrave family. In the pew, Margaret sat in silence as the words rained over her heart. Once she believed faith would protect her children, but now even the church had turned its back. She clutched their small hands while the sermon thundered about corruption and curses, and she felt the tremor in her own chest, for she too had begun to fear what she could not name. At home, she tried to shield them. She kept them close, away from the gossip, away from the pointing fingers. Yet she could not close the doors against what she saw with her own eyes. She watched them in the yard, their movements too similar, too precise. She watched them in the night, their breathing never breaking rhythm, their eyes opening together when the floor creaked. Her husband grew colder each day. He spoke less to the boys and more to his bottle, his gaze heavy with something between fear and hatred. He told Margaret that the land itself was changing since their birth. The crops along the field edges grew thin, the animals restless, the nights colder than memory could recall. He swore the twins carried misfortune in their very skin when Margaret protested. He struck the table with his hand and shouted that some children were not meant for this earth, that God himself must have turned his face away from them. His voice echoed through the small farmhouse, and the twins turned to look at him with eyes that did not flinch, not even for a moment. The silence in their gaze broke his words into nothing. Margaret felt torn in two. Her heart ached with love when she held them, yet dread coiled inside her chest when they stared too long into each other's faces. She wondered if they were speaking silently in some language she could not hear. She wondered if they even needed her at all, or if their bond had replaced the world around them. The town grew harsher with time. Shopkeepers refused to serve them. Neighbors barred their doors at their approach, and when Margaret went to market alone, whispers followed her like shadows. Men shook their heads. Women muttered that no good would come from a mother who dared to raise cursed children. One evening, As the sun sank into the hills, Margaret walked home with the boys, the road empty, except for the sound of their small feet beside her. Suddenly a stone flew from the shadows, striking the dirt near her dress. She turned quickly, but saw only a group of children running away, their laughter echoing cruelly behind them. The twins said nothing, but their eyes glowed faintly in the twilight, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Later that night, she lay awake, listening to their steady breaths in the darkness. She prayed for protection, for answers, for release. Yet in the stillness, she wondered if the whispers were true, if perhaps her sons were not simply misunderstood, but something far beyond human. The next morning, the pastor visited the farmhouse. He did not come with comfort or scripture. He stood in the doorway, his face hard and his voice cold. He told Margaret that there were souls better left unbaptized, that some bonds were not sacred but blasphemous. He warned her that the community would not tolerate much more, and then he left without waiting for her reply. Margaret closed the door, her hands trembling. The boys watched her silently from the table, their eyes too, knowing, too calm. She forced a smile for them, but deep inside she felt the weight of truth pressing down. She could not protect them from the world, and she could not protect herself from the fear blooming within her heart. And so the town kept whispering. The fear kept spreading, and the Hargrave twins became not children but shadows cast over every soul that dared to look too closely. One day the sky was clear above the Hargrave fields, the sun resting warm on the soil as Joseph helped his father with the tools of the farm. The boy was small yet eager, his hands clumsy but willing to work beside a man who grew more silent with each passing year. Joseph lifted a rusted blade, its edge sharper than it appeared, and in one careless moment his hand slipped the metal bit into his palm, a thin line of red breaking open across his skin. The sting shot through him, and he cried out. At that very instant from the barn came a scream. Jeremiah, his twin, collapsed to his knees, clutching a hand that bore no wound. His eyes wide, his face twisted in agony, though no blade had touched him. Margaret rushed forward, dropping the basket. She carried the hens, scattering in a flurry of feathers. She reached Joseph first, pulling the tool away and wrapping her apron around the bleeding hand. Yet when she turned, she froze. Jeremiah's hand trembled before her eyes, and as she stared, a bruise darkened on his palm, the same line, the same shape as Joseph's cut. Though the flesh was never broken, the color spread across the skin as if pain itself had been drawn across their bodies. The father stepped back, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He whispered words that he had been holding inside for years. No natural bond could cause such horrors. No mother's love could excuse such curses. He muttered that the boys were chained to something unholy. Margaret tried to calm him, but her own heart raced. She held Joseph close, pressing the cloth against his wound, while Jeremiah gasped for breath as if every nerve inside him burned. The twins looked at one another, their eyes meeting, steady and silent, as though they both understood what no one else could see. The father turned away, his hands shaking. He refused to touch them, refused even to meet their gaze. He went back into the house, muttering under his breath. Words of scripture twisted into curses, his voice breaking with fear and anger. Margaret heard him through the open window, calling them an abomination, calling them proof that God had turned his face from the Hargraves. The boys said nothing. They sat side by side in the dirt, one bleeding, one bruised Joseph's tears, streaking his cheeks, Jeremiah's face white with pain. Yet their shoulders leaned together as though they drew strength, not from their parents, not from the earth around them, but from one another alone. As night fell, the cut was cleaned and bound, but Margaret could not sleep. She rose from her bed and stood over them while they lay on the straw mattress, their hands resting side by side. She saw in the flicker of the candle how even in sleep their fingers twitched, at the same time how their chests rose and fell in perfect rhythm. She whispered prayers again, but her voice shook. She wondered if her husband was right, if perhaps no earthly explanation could exist for children who shared wounds without touch, who carried each other's pain without reason. In the morning, the village learned of the event, the story spreading faster than fire. The butcher swore he had heard Margaret's cry from the fields. The baker claimed the boys must carry a devil's pact, and women refused to come near the farmhouse, wagging their heads with pity for Margaret and fear for themselves. Their father grew more restless by the day. He avoided the barn where the tools hung. He avoided the fields where the accident had happened. He would not touch the boys. When they reached for him, he would step back as if their hands carried fire. He drank more, his voice turning harsh each time he spoke of them. The twins, however, seemed unchanged. They carried on together. Joseph's hand healing Jeremiah's bruise fading, yet both watched each other constantly, as though waiting for the next wave of pain, as though bracing for the invisible cord that bound them to pull again. Margaret felt trapped between love and terror. She could not abandon them yet. She could not deny the truth of what she had seen. She replayed the moment endlessly in her mind. The flash of the blade, the cry from the barn, the bruise that bloomed without cause. She wished it was a nightmare. Yet the scar on Joseph's palm remained, to remind her that it was not. From that day the Hargrave farmhouse grew colder, the father more distant, the mother more afraid, and the twins more bound than ever by the unseen chain that stitched their bodies and souls together in ways the world would never understand. Late one evening, the air was heavy with the stillness that comes before nightfall. The sun had begun to sink behind the trees, casting the river in a dim glow of orange and shadow. Joseph had wandered too close to the water, his young curiosity stronger than his caution. The surface shimmered dark and restless, and within moments his foot slipped against the wet stones. His body pitched forward, and the river swallowed him whole. The current was stronger than it appeared. It pulled him under thrashing. Waves rising around him, he fought for air, his arms flailing against the cold drag of the water. The sound of his cry was lost beneath the rush of the river, but the villagers nearby heard the splash and the frantic struggle. They shouted in alarm, rushing from the path to the bank as the shouts filled the air. Another sound rose. Jeremiah on the shore fell to his knees, clutching his throat, his face turning pale, his lips parting for breath that would not come. His chest heaved in desperation, as if unseen hands held him beneath the same water, though he had never touched it. His small fingers clawed at his neck, his eyes bulging with terror. The villagers were torn. Some ran into the river, reaching for Joseph, who vanished and reappeared between the rolling waves, while others turned to Jeremiah, unable to comprehend why his body choked as if he too were drowning. Margaret arrived moments later, her heart in her throat. She screamed for her sons, but the storm of confusion drowned her voice. Two men waded deep into the current, their arms plunging beneath the water until they found Joseph, his body twisting, his mouth gasping as they pulled him to the surface. He coughed violently, water streaming from his lips, his chest convulsing. With each attempt at breath, they dragged him toward the shore, where Margaret fell to her knees, gathering him in her arms, tears mixing with the spray of the river. At that exact instant, Jeremiah collapsed beside her, his small body striking the earth. He rolled onto his side, his throat convulsing, his mouth opening wide, and to the horror of all who watched, a stream of water spilled from him, though he had never touched the current. His cries mingled with Joseph's, their bodies shaking together, in mirrored torment. The crowd stood frozen, the only sound the echo of their coughing and the ceaseless rush of the river. No words rose in the throats of the villagers, for none could explain what they had seen. The impossible truth spread through their eyes in silence. Two boys, one drowning in the river, the other choking on dry land, bound together by an unseen chain. Margaret gathered them both, Joseph shivering, Jeremiah trembling, each child pale and weak yet still breathing. She held them tight against her chest, rocking back and forth, her sobs rising into the dusk. The villagers whispered among themselves, crossing themselves or muttering prayers to ward away the evil that clung to the Hargrave name. When Joseph finally opened his eyes, his brother did the same, their gazes locking across their mother's arms. No words spoken yet, no words needed. Their bond spoke louder than breath, louder than reason. Margaret felt it deep within her bones. She felt the truth she dared not speak. Her children were not like others. They were not free of each other. They were trapped in a bond that defied the laws of God and nature. That night, the story of the river spread through the town. Before the moon rose, the tale had reached every ear. Men swore they saw one boy spit out river water without ever stepping in. Women swore they would never let their children near the Hargraves again. Even the pastor fell silent when asked to explain, for no scripture spoke of such a thing at home. Margaret dried their clothes, her hands trembling. She lit candles though the night was still. She pressed her sons into bed together, covering them with blankets, her heart aching with love and fear. She watched as they lay side by side, their breaths in perfect rhythm, their eyes never closing until sleep finally claimed them both. Outside the farmhouse, the wind carried a strange sound through the trees. The villagers who walked the road later said they heard voices along the river, whispers low and chilling, as though the water itself remembered what had happened, as though the river carried secrets not meant for human ears. And so the river incident became another chapter in the curse of the Hargrave twins, another proof that what bound them was something the living could not understand, something that grew darker with every passing day. Desperation had settled thick over the Hargrave farmhouse after the river incident. The whispers of the village grew sharper each day, and Margaret found herself unable to sleep. Her husband drank more, his eyes dark with something colder than sorrow, and in the silence of those long nights the only sounds were the synchronized breaths of her sons. Margaret finally begged her husband to fetch a doctor from the nearby town, hoping science might reveal what faith and reason could not. The doctor arrived on a gray morning, his carriage wheels crunching over the dirt path. He was a tall man with spectacles perched on his nose, a man who believed in reason above superstition. He carried his black bag with confidence, stepping into the farmhouse with the authority of knowledge. Margaret welcomed him with weary hope, her hands wringing as she led him to the boys. Joseph and Jeremiah sat side by side on the wooden bench, their eyes following the doctor, the way wolves follow prey. The doctor introduced himself, speaking gently as he unpacked his tools. He touched their pulses, measured their breathing, peered into their eyes and pressed the stethoscope to their chests. Both boys, silent, both bodies calm, their hearts beat in perfect unison, not a second apart. The doctor frowned, adjusting his glasses. He asked them to move one arm, then the other. They obeyed, but when Joseph lifted his hand, Jeremiah's fingers twitched in mirror. When Jeremiah blinked, Joseph's lashes fluttered the same. The doctor muttered to himself, noting down observations, yet every note only deepened the impossibility. Margaret asked again and again what it meant, why her boys behaved so strangely. The doctor shook his head, muttering that no medical text, no anatomy, no natural science could explain such a bond. He spoke of shared nerves, shared sensations, but the words fell hollow even to his own ears. At last he packed his bag, preparing to leave, his face set in lines of unease. The farmhouse felt heavier than when he had entered, the silence of the twins pressing against him as he stood. The boys sat still, their eyes fixed upon him, unblinking, unbroken. The air around them thickened with something that felt alive. He paused by the door, and that was when it happened. Both boys opened their mouths together and spoke in a single voice, a voice soft, yet sharp, that sliced through the quiet. They spoke words that belonged not to Margaret, not to their father, not to anyone in the village, but to the doctor himself. They told of a night from his childhood when he had stolen coins from his father's desk and sworn no one would ever know. They told of the shame that followed when his father accused a servant who was beaten and cast out. They told of the guilt that had weighed upon him for years, the secret that had rotted within him, unseen, unheard, unspoken, until this moment. The doctor froze, his bag slipping from his hand, his spectacles sliding down his nose. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His heart thundered against his ribs, his face drained of color. He staggered back, his eyes darting between the boys whose gaze never wavered, who spoke still in the same calm, unbroken tone. Margaret clutched her hands to her chest, horrified by the words. She did not understand the details, but she felt the weight of confession in their voices. Her husband turned pale, his bottle slipping from his fingers as the truth unfolded before them. Both parents stared at their sons in a silence thicker than any storm. When the boys finished speaking, they closed their mouths together, their heads tilting in perfect unison, their eyes falling back to the floor as though nothing had been said. The farmhouse filled with the sound of the doctor's ragged breathing. He snatched his bag from the floor, muttering that he could not stay, that the air itself was poison around them. He stumbled from the house into the dirt road, his footsteps uneven as he half ran to his carriage. He climbed inside, his hands shaking upon the reins, and whipped the horse into motion, never once looking back. The wheels threw mud into the air as he fled down the road, and by nightfall the town was already filled with the tale of what he had heard. Margaret sat by the fire, her son silent beside her, the flames dancing shadows across their faces. She tried to ask them how they knew what they had spoken, but neither boy answered. Instead, they stared into the fire together, their eyes reflecting the same light, their lips pressed closed as if bound by something far older than her questions. Their father said nothing. He sat in his chair, a shadow upon his face, his knuckles white around the armrest. He muttered only once, in a voice cracked with fear, that no human children could hold the sins of another man, that what lived inside those boys was not flesh and blood, but something darker. That night, Margaret prayed harder than ever before, her voice breaking as she begged for mercy, begged for answers, begged for deliverance from the mystery that consumed her home. Yet no answer came, only the sound of the twins breathing together, their rhythm, steady, their silence unshaken, their bond unbroken. And so the visit of the doctor became another mark upon the legend of the Hargrave twins, proof that what they carried could pierce even the mind of a man of science, proof that their bond was not bound by flesh or reason, but by something older and far more terrifying than the world could explain. The village turned against the Hargraves as though a shadow had stretched over their land and poisoned everything within reach. It began with the crops. The fields that once grew tall and green turned brittle and brown. The corn failed to sprout. The wheat bent under a strange blight. Leaves blackened as if touched by invisible fire. Neighbors whispered that the soil itself rejected the presence of the twins. Then came the livestock. Cows that had given milk for years suddenly weakened, their ribs showing through their hides. Chickens laid no eggs, their feathers falling like autumn leaves. Sheep refused to graze, bleating into the night until their voices grew hoarse. The men of the village cursed under their breath, pointing at the Hargrave farmhouse with suspicion and fear. By the well in the square, women muttered darkly about curses, about devils sent to walk in the form of children. They told stories of how the twins stared without blinking, how their laughter carried on the wind. When no one else was near, children ran past the farmhouse with stones in their hands, throwing them at the fence before fleeing, their voices carrying cries of witchcraft through the dusk. The pastor stood in the pulpit warning the congregation that some things born into this world were not meant to be embraced, that evil sometimes wore the face of innocence. He spoke without naming the family, yet every head turned toward the Hargraves. The fear had grown too strong to be disguised. Soon the men of the village came with demands. They gathered outside the farmhouse, torches in hand. Their voices rising as one, they shouted for Margaret and her husband to leave, to take their cursed children far from the land, before ruin spread further. Margaret stood in the doorway, clutching Joseph and Jeremiah to her sides, her face pale but her voice unyielding. She declared she would never abandon her sons, no matter the hatred of neighbors, no matter the threat. The crowd dispersed, but their anger did not fade each day. The glares grew sharper each night. The mutters of plans and warnings reached Margaret's ears. She barred the doors with heavy wood and prayed over the windows. Yet no prayer silenced the unease that grew within her own heart. For each night when darkness settled, when the village slept, and even her husband's snores filled the house, Margaret remained awake, lying on her narrow bed. She listened, and always she heard it. The voices of her sons rising in unison. From their room, words in no tongue she recognized, flowing like a chant, their tones low and strange, weaving together like a hymn from some forgotten church. Sometimes the voices rose and fell like the tide. Other times they whispered so faintly, she had to press her ear to the wall to be sure it was not the wind. Yet no matter how they shifted, they always spoke together, never apart. Their words aligned as though one mind spoke through two mouths. She trembled beneath her blanket, her prayers catching in her throat. She wanted to shake them awake, to demand what tongue they spoke. Yet fear held her still, for she felt deep in her bones that the language was not meant for her, not meant for any human ear. It was older than the soil, older than the church, older than the village itself. Her husband grew restless with each passing day. He muttered that they should leave, abandon the farm, abandon everything, but Margaret clung tighter to her boys. She refused to let the world name them evil. She refused to surrender them, even as she herself began to doubt the humanity that lingered within their eyes. One evening she entered their room and found them sitting cross-legged upon the floor, their faces tilted toward each other, their lips moving in silence, though she could hear the faintest sound of that language echoing between them. They stopped only when they saw her standing in the doorway, their eyes reflecting the candlelight in perfect sameness. She dropped the candle, almost burning herself in her haste to flee. The village soon carried more tales. Men swore they saw lights flickering in the Hargrave windows when no candle had been lit. Women swore the air around the farm was colder than any other place. Children swore the twins' eyes glowed in the moonlight, all voices together building the noose of superstition tighter around the family's neck. Margaret wept into her hands, but she did not bend. She held her sons closer each day, pressing kisses to their brows, whispering words of love, though their faces did not soften, though their gazes never broke. She loved them even as she feared them, even as she wondered in the still hours of night whether what grew within them was beyond love, beyond the reach of a mother's arms. And so the Hargrave land became cursed in the minds of the people, its soil barren, its animals sick, its farmhouse filled with whispers in strange tongues. And though the village turned hostile and the world seemed to close against them, Margaret would not let go of her children, clinging to them, even as the darkness around them thickened with each passing night. One night a storm rolled across the valley, its winds howling like a chorus of the damned. The rain beat against the farmhouse roof in relentless rhythm. Lightning split the sky again and again, spilling pale light through the cracks of the shutters. Each flash painted the Hargrave rooms in brief glimpses of white terror and shadow. Inside, the boys slept side by side upon their narrow beds, until suddenly Joseph woke with a scream, his voice tearing through the thunder, his body stiff as though an unseen hand had frozen him in place, his arms rigid, his legs unbending, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring toward the ceiling as if he saw something no mortal was meant to see. His scream rang sharp and high until it cracked into silence, only to rise again stronger, louder. Across the room, Jeremiah convulsed, his small body twisting upon the floor, his hands clawing at his throat, his chest rising and falling in ragged, desperate gasps, his mouth opening wide but no breath coming, no air reaching his lungs. He rolled against the wooden planks, his heels striking the boards in frantic rhythm, his skin pale, his lips already tinged. Blue Margaret burst into the room, her nightdress clinging to her. From the sweat of terror, her hair unbound, her eyes wide with fear. She reached first for Joseph, but his body was rigid beneath her touch, his skin clammy, his mouth still open in a cry that would not stop, his small frame trembling as though caught between worlds. She turned in frantic panic toward Jeremiah, whose body writhed like a snake in its death throes. The storm outside grew wilder, the thunder louder, the wind rattled the shutters as though trying to tear them free. And yet within that storm, another more terrible sound filled the farmhouse. The twin cries, one of pain, one of suffocation, both bound together, both echoing as if from the same throat. Margaret screamed for her husband, but no answer came, only the storm and the terrible sound of her children. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, desperate to reach both at once. But before she could, Joseph's cry stopped. It ended, not in a whimper, not in a gasp, but in an abrupt silence that fell heavier than thunder. His body went still, his eyes rolled back, his arms dropped to his sides like the limbs of a broken doll. The silence of his voice made the storm seem quiet. The room shuddered with the absence. Margaret froze. Her heart stopped in her chest, her hands trembling above his still body, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes already knew. She turned to Jeremiah, his body still twisting, his lips gasping soundlessly. The horror of watching one son go still while the other clung desperately to life split her soul in two. She fell to her knees between them, her hands torn by the wooden floor, her voice breaking into sobs. She reached for Joseph, shaking him, pleading his name, but his chest did not rise. No breath stirred his lips, no spark remained in his eyes. She turned then to Jeremiah, whose chest still fought for air, whose throat still rattled with invisible hands around it. She pressed her palm against his chest, praying, begging, commanding that he breathe, that he hold on. The lightning flashed again, revealing her face streaked with tears. The boys' bodies locked in unnatural harmony, one still as death, the other writhing, as if to join his brother. The storm outside seemed to bow to the storm within the farmhouse, the walls groaning, the shutters slamming, the heavens themselves raging, as though they too could not accept what had begun. Margaret rocked between them, her voice rising in desperate prayer to any god that might hear. She called on the saints, on the angels, on the heavens themselves, her cries merging with the storm until her throat burned. She begged for mercy for one son, or for both. She begged to be taken in their place. She begged, but no answer came, only the sound of Jeremiah's gasps and the silence of Joseph's corpse. The candle in the corner guttered out, plunging the room into darkness, except for the flashes of lightning, and in that unnatural glow, Margaret thought, she saw shapes upon the walls, shadows that did not belong to her, nor to the boys, nor to the storm. They twisted and bent, with each lightning strike, leaning closer as though watching the moment, as though waiting. Jeremiah's gasps slowed his body, twitching weaker. His lips parting in a final shallow breath, Margaret clutched him to her chest, rocking back and forth, whispering that he must stay, that he must not follow his brother into the stillness. She pressed her lips to his forehead, her tears soaking his skin, her trembling voice vowing she would not let him go. But in the silence that followed the thunder in the gap between lightning strikes, Margaret knew a truth too terrible to name. She knew the bond between her sons was not one she could break with love or prayer. She knew the silence of Joseph would echo forever in Jeremiah's breath, and that the night of the storm was only the beginning of the true horror that bound them. At that very moment, Jeremiah let out a strangled gasp, his chest collapsing inward as if an unseen hand pressed with crushing weight upon him. His small frame bent and twisted under that invisible burden, his fingers clawing at the empty air, his mouth wide in a silent plea for mercy, his body trembling as though it knew what the soul already understood. Joseph lay still, his voice forever silenced, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling. Yet Jeremiah, who had not been touched, mirrored every motion of his brother's final agony. He writhed upon the wooden floorboards, his knees drawn tight against his chest, his lungs fighting for breath that would not come, each shallow gasp weaker than the last, until his body shuddered in perfect unison with the stillness that had already claimed his twin. Margaret knelt between them, her screams lost in the roar of the storm, her arms reaching to hold both, but finding neither. She pressed her palms against Joseph's cold cheek, whispering his name again and again, then turned to Jeremiah, cradling him against her chest, her tears spilling into his hair. She begged him to fight. She begged him not to leave her. She begged. But her words had no weight against the unseen force that bound her sons together. The storm rattled the farmhouse, shaking the shutters until they nearly tore from their hinges. The lightning flared white across the sky, illuminating the room in unnatural brilliance. In each flash, the boys lay mirrored, one in death and one in dying, their eyes wide, unblinking, fixed not on their mother, not on the walls, not on the heavens, but upon something far beyond the reach of human sight, as if they gazed through the veil into a world Margaret could not touch. Within minutes, Jeremiah's gasps faltered. His chest rose once more, then fell without return. The sound of breath ceased. The struggle ended. His body slackened in her arms, his head tilting lifeless against her shoulder. Margaret wailed her cry, piercing sharper than thunder, her voice breaking in a way that could never mend. She shook him violently, as though she could force life back into him, as though her desperation alone could defy the bond that had dragged him into the abyss beside his brother. Now, both boys lay upon the floor, their forms stilled, their eyes wide and glassy, unclosed, unblinking, staring into a distance Margaret could not follow. They seemed transfixed by something unseen, something eternal. Their gazes locked on the same point of emptiness, their mouths parted slightly, as if they had died in the midst of some unfinished word. Their final silence filling the farmhouse heavier than any storm. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. The rain hammered the roof. The thunder split the heavens, yet within that house, a silence deeper than nature's fury claimed dominion. Margaret crouched between the bodies of her sons, her hands trembling as she tried to shut their eyes, but their lids resisted her touch. Their gaze refusing to yield to darkness, she drew back in horror, her chest heaving as she realized they would never close. The shadows on the walls lengthened in the flicker of lightning. They bent and twisted with movements that did not belong to candle or flame. They seemed to lean closer to the twins, as if drawn by their stillness, as if claiming them for themselves. Margaret could not look away, her mind unraveling as she whispered prayers to a God she no longer trusted. Time lost all meaning in that room, minutes stretched into eternities. She sat frozen in grief, listening to the storm above and the silence below the eyes of her sons, fixed forever on that unseen point, their lifeless stares seeming to pierce through her as though they could still see something though she could not. Margaret clutched her chest, feeling her own heart struggle under the weight of sorrow, yet knowing with certainty that the mystery that bound her children was far from finished. The storm outside would pass, the dawn would rise. Yet the memory of that night would not leave the Hargrave farmhouse. The sight of two brothers gone together, their bodies mirroring one another, their eyes open to horrors beyond the veil that no mother should ever witness. It was the night the bond between Joseph and Jeremiah transcended the flesh, the night their story became more than grief. It became a mystery that no living soul could explain. The twins were buried side by side in the far corner of the graveyard, where the earth was soft and the trees leaned over like watchful sentinels. Their graves were simple mounds marked with wooden crosses, carved hastily by trembling hands. No hymns were sung, no bells were tolled. The villagers kept their distance, watching from beyond the cemetery gates with faces pale and eyes downcast, for none dared approach too near the resting place of boys they believed were never fully human. The air that day was heavy, as if the sky itself carried the weight of what had been done. The clouds hung low, threatening rain though none fell. A stillness spread through the graveyard, broken only by the creak of branches swaying gently above the fresh dirt. Margaret knelt between the graves, her dress stained with soil, her fingers tracing the rough wood of the crosses, her tears soaking the earth that now kept her sons from her arms. She whispered to them softly, words no one else could hear, begging them to rest, though she feared they never would. When the graves were finished, the villagers turned quickly away. No prayers were offered, at least not aloud, though some muttered blessings under their breath. As they fled from that place, they spoke of curses of evil, of things beyond God's order, and though they left flowers on other graves, none were placed on the twins' mound. The soil was left bare, as if no offering would be accepted by the ground that held them. Nights passed, and with them came whispers carried on the wind. The graveyard became a place of dread. Children dared one another to walk its edge, but none went near the corner where the twins slept. It was said that on stormy nights, when the clouds split with lightning and the rain poured heavy, two voices rose in chorus from the trees, their words indistinct, their tones strange, one, soft one, sharp, weaving together in a sound that made the bravest men run shivering from the dark. Some claimed they saw movement among the graves, shadows flickering against the stones, though no lanterns burned. They spoke of figures crouched low beside the crosses, their shapes small like boys, their eyes glowing faint when the storm was at its peak. The pastor who once condemned the children swore never to pass the graveyard again after he heard laughter that echoed like it came from under the earth. Margaret returned often to sit beside her sons. She would bring food and water as though they might still need it, her lips moving in hushed conversation to the silence that answered her hum. Yet told them of her days of the farm, of the loneliness that now consumed her heart. She spoke to them as though they could still hear, and in her grief she convinced herself that sometimes she heard them answer that the rustle of the trees was not mere wind, but the voices of her lost children whispering secrets too faint for others to catch. Years went on, but the fear never lifted. The Hargrave twins became more than a memory. They became a warning whispered at night to children who misbehaved. Mothers would say, "Do not wander in the storm," or "the twins will call your name." "Do not lie, or they will come in your dreams." "Do not stare too long into your brother's eyes, or you will see what they saw." For their story grew into legend. A legend no science could touch. Doctors came years later, curious scholars chasing rumors, but none could explain what had happened. No disease, no known condition, no theory could account for the bond the twins shared. their deaths mirrored as perfectly as their lives. Every explanation fell short in the face of the impossible. The graves stood as silent defiance against reason, and men of learning left in frustration, their logic defeated by the whispers that rose in the night. As time stretched forward, and generations passed, the village changed. The farmland grew into new homes and roads, yet still no one built near the graveyard. It remained untouched, a place feared and avoided. Stories of the Hargrave twins passed down from parent to child, their names spoken in hushed voices, their fate never forgotten, for the people knew that legends are born from truths too dark to fade. And so in Kentucky, the mystery endures. It lingers in the soil, in the trees, in the thunder that cracks across the hills. On stormy nights, those who dare to listen swear they still hear it. The sound of two voices carried through the branches, low and haunting, as though death itself could not silence their bond. Joseph and Jeremiah, forever bound, forever whispered about, forever feared. Their mother's grief faded into the ground, their father's name forgotten, the farm long gone. Yet the legend remained the story of two brothers born together, who lived as one and died as one. No science could explain them. No faith could soothe the terror they inspired. They were and remain a riddle carved into the bones of Kentucky itself. The Hargrave twins became more than children. They became a shadow on the land, a mystery that breathes even now, for on nights when the wind turns cold and the sky trembles with lightning, some still claim to hear them whispering, not to each other, but to anyone willing to listen.